My brother took the iPhone out of my mother's hand and told her she did not need to be answering calls from her church friends anymore because they were only making her more confused. My mother, Alberta, stood there and watched that phone disappear into Marcus's pocket like she was watching the last thread connecting her to the outside world get cut right in front of her. He had already taken my father's chair at the head of the dining table, moved my mother to a wobbly folding chair in the darkest corner near the kitchen doorway, the spot where she sat in silence, smiling, telling everyone everything was fine while the bruise on her upper arm turned purple from where he had grabbed her and shaken her the night before. I came home to Georgia after my last deployment and realized my mother was being erased inside her own house, the house she had lived in for 40 years, the house my father built for her. Marcus believed he had the right, because he was the one who stayed. But he had no idea what it cost my mother to keep quiet for 30 years so that I could be standing here today. I did not come back to fight over property. I came back to put my mother where she belongs, at the head of that table. I stood on the front porch with my duffel bag still in my hand, staring at the dark screen of my mother's phone inside Marcus's pocket, and I knew right then that the silence in this house was not an accident. It was a wall someone had built on purpose. This house in Georgia used to smell like cornbread every time I came home, but that afternoon all I could smell was dust and something stale and heavy that had settled into everything. I took a deep breath, held myself the way I had been trained to hold myself, and pushed open the old wooden door to step inside. The dining room used to be the heart of this house, the place where my mother spent entire afternoons preparing meals for everyone she loved, pulling out her good china, setting the table the way her own mother had taught her. But when I walked in, the contrast hit me before anything else. Her best porcelain was still sitting behind the glass cabinet, coated in a thin layer of dust that told me nobody had touched it in months, and on the table there were only disposable plastic plates, the kind you buy in bulk at the dollar store. Marcus was sitting in my father's armchair at the head of the table like he had earned it, and Jennifer, his wife, was scrolling through her phone without looking up. My mother, the woman who owned this house, the woman who had paid off the mortgage with 40 years of work, was sitting on a folding chair in the darkest corner near the kitchen doorway. She was so quiet, so still, that I almost did not see her there at all until she lifted her head and looked at me with eyes that held something between shock and fear. She had lost weight since the last time I saw her. Her shoulders were pulled inward, the way a person holds themselves when they are trying to take up less space, to be smaller, to disappear. Marcus was talking non-stop about his plans to renovate the entire house, going on about new paint colors and tearing out my mother's garden like she was not sitting right there listening to every word. I saw her start to open her mouth, but the second Marcus glanced her way, she dropped her head back down to her plastic plate. The guilt hit me all at once, heavy and sudden, because for 18 months I had believed my brother's casual updates that everything at home was fine, that Mom was doing great, that he had it all under control. Standing in that room, the room where I had eaten Thanksgiving dinner every year of my life, I understood that I had let my mother become invisible inside the house she had built from nothing over 4 decades. Dinner passed in a silence so heavy I could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind me. Marcus and Jennifer had gone to bed early, leaving me and my mother alone in the dim kitchen where the overhead light had been set so low it barely reached the corners. I wanted to hold her, wanted to feel the warmth I had always known from this woman, but something had been put between us, something I could not see, but could feel like a wall of glass. Georgia in July is an oven, even after the sun goes down. The heat sits on your skin and does not leave, and most people in the neighborhood were sitting outside in shorts and tank tops trying to catch whatever breeze came through. But my mother was wearing a long-sleeved cardigan buttoned to her wrists and a silk scarf wrapped tight around her neck. When I reached up to grab the old coffee pot from the high shelf, she rushed forward to stop me, and when she raised her arm, the sleeve slipped down just enough to show a patch of dark purple bruising that spread across her wrist like spilled ink, uneven and ugly against her thin skin. She pulled the sleeve back down so fast it startled me. I had seen injuries on the field, shrapnel wounds and impact abrasions and all kinds of damage that the human body can take and still keep going. But the marks on my mother's wrist were a different shape entirely. They were not from bumping into a cabinet door, which is what she would tell me a moment later. Those marks were the imprint of fingers that had closed around her wrist and squeezed. What made my chest tighten was not the bruise itself, but the look in her eyes when she realized I had seen it, because she was not afraid of the pain. She was afraid I would know the truth. My mother was protecting the person who had done this to her, and that fact cut deeper than anything I had ever felt. "Mom, what happened to your arm?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as I could even though everything inside me was shaking. She gave me a small smile, the kind that never reaches the eyes, and waved her hand like it was nothing worth mentioning. "Oh, honey, I am getting old. My legs are not as steady as they used to be. I must have bumped into the kitchen cabinet again while I was cleaning up," she said, in a tone so practiced and so flat that it sounded rehearsed. She changed the subject to asking about my work, about whether I was eating enough, and the whole time her hands never stopped pulling at her sleeves, tugging them down over her wrists like a reflex she had taught herself without even knowing it. I stood there in that kitchen that smelled like bleach and old coffee grounds, and I understood that the wall my mother had built around her silence was stronger than any base I had ever been stationed at. The next morning, after Marcus had driven Jennifer to work, I used that narrow window of quiet to start looking for what I already knew I was going to find. I walked into my mother's bathroom, where a row of small orange prescription bottles were lined up on the shelf under the fluorescent light that buzzed and flickered like it had not been replaced in years. The training I had from years as a comptroller kicked in before I could think twice. I picked up each bottle and read the label. The lisinopril for her blood pressure had been empty for 3 months. The arthritis medication she had been taking since before I left for the Army was expired. The pill organizer she used to fill every Sunday night, the one I had watched her sit at the kitchen counter and sort out for as long as I could remember, was gathering dust with nothing in it. Meanwhile, Marcus had been emailing me every month to report that he was spending over $500 on her prescriptions from the family account. I found her medical statements tucked under her Bible on the nightstand, and when I looked through them, there was not a single new transaction at CVS or Walgreens for the entire quarter. I could feel the anger building in my chest, the kind that does not come out as yelling but sits there like a weight that makes it hard to breathe. Marcus was not just taking money, he was gambling with my mother's life. This was not carelessness. This was a man who had decided that his mother's health was an expense he could cut to fund whatever he was spending the money on instead. I kept thinking about how tired she had looked at dinner, and I understood now that it was not age making her look that way. It was pain, the kind that comes from a body that has been left to fight on its own without the medication it needs to function. My brother had turned our mother's trust into something he could use, and he did not care what it cost her. "Elena, what are you doing in there?" Her voice came soft and careful from the doorway, and I flinched because I had not heard her walk up. I stepped out holding the empty lisinopril bottle, and she looked at it, and then looked at me with an expression I will never forget. A mix of embarrassment and something that looked like giving in. She told me Marcus had said the prescriptions were too expensive, and that she should save the money for more important things for the family. "I do not want to be a burden on anyone," she said, and she said it the way a person says something they have repeated to themselves so many times they almost believe it. Standing there looking at my mother, at the lines on her face and the way she held herself like she was apologizing for taking up space, I knew the time for staying quiet was over. I was not going to let this go on for one more day. I think there are people listening to this right now who know what it feels like to hide your own pain because you do not want your children to worry. Maybe you have skipped a refill because someone told you it was not worth the cost. Or maybe you have sat in a waiting room alone because you did not want to ask anyone to drive you. If that is you, I want you to know that your health is not a luxury and it is not negotiable. Tell me your story in the comments, because the love that mothers carry should never have to carry silence too. And if this meant something to you, hit that like button so I know that we are in this together. My mother had gone to lie down for her afternoon rest, and Marcus still had not come back from whatever he had been doing all day, the kind of trip he called a business meeting, but that I was certain involved a card table or a bar tab somewhere across town. I sat down at my father's desk, felt the layer of time that had settled over his things, the old pen holder he had carved himself, the reading glasses he never threw away, and I started going through the file folders Marcus had left behind like he never expected anyone to look. Under a stuck drawer that took some work to pry open, I found a stack of retirement account statements for my mother's savings that had been mailed to Marcus's office address instead of the house. The numbers told a story I did not want to read, but could not look away from. My mother's lifetime savings, more than $200,000 built up over decades of careful living, had been drained in steady withdrawals of $10,000 a month. There was a check made out for $5,000 with the memo line reading tuition. But the signature that read Alberta Morrison did not look right. The loops were too smooth, too confident. My mother's real handwriting had a natural tremor in it, the slight shake of a 65-year-old hand, and this signature had none of that. I held the check in one hand and pulled out the letter my mother had sent me last year for my birthday, the one she had written in her own careful script, and I compared them side by side. The handwriting was not even close. Marcus had not just lied to my mother. He had forged her name on paper to make his greed look legal. In the Army, falsifying documents can end a career and land you in a cell. But here, in this house, it was something worse. It was a son using his mother's identity to rob her blind. I kept thinking about all the money I had been sending home every month, trusting Marcus to manage it, never once asking to see a receipt. Through the window, I could see my mother's hydrangea garden still blooming in the afternoon light, the blue and purple clusters she had planted the year I graduated high school, and the sight of something so beautiful on the other side of glass, while everything in this room was falling apart, made the whole thing feel unreal. But the numbers on the paper in my hand were real. This was not a family disagreement about how to split the bills. This was a deliberate plan to take everything my mother had and strip away her ability to live on her own terms. Marcus called it care expenses, but I knew those invoices had never served my mother. He was turning her into someone who could not survive without him, so that she would never question what he was doing. I pulled out my phone and started photographing every document, every statement, every number that did not add up. I needed a lawyer I could trust, someone who understood power of attorney law in Georgia and what it meant when those documents were used against the person they were supposed to protect. I was deep in the paperwork when the sound of Marcus's car roaring into the garage sent me scrambling to put everything back where I had found it, stack the folders exactly as they had been, slide the drawer closed. I had to walk out of that room looking like nothing had happened, like I had just been sitting there waiting for him when everything inside me had already shifted. Marcus came through the door carrying a shopping bag from a high-end clothing store, the kind of place my mother had never stepped foot in because she believed spending that kind of money on clothes was wasteful. He asked me if I wanted to go out for dinner, the question delivered with the easy charm of a man who had practiced being likable his entire life. I looked into his eyes and saw something I had never allowed myself to see before, a kind of emptiness behind the performance that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My mother, Alberta, deserved every cent she had earned over 40 years of labor and sacrifice, and I was going to make sure she got it back. I spent the rest of that evening in my old bedroom with my phone, cross-referencing dates and amounts, building the kind of spreadsheet that would have earned a commendation on base. Every transaction Marcus had made from my mother's accounts told a story of casual theft dressed up as family duty, and by midnight I had documented enough to know this was not going to end with a conversation. It was going to end with a courtroom. That Sunday afternoon, I talked Marcus into letting me take my mother to the group meeting at the local senior center, the place where she used to spend most of her free time before I shipped out. Back when she ran the book club and organized the holiday bake sale every December. Marcus shrugged and agreed with a look on his face that said he did not think it mattered, but he made sure to remind my mother to take it easy and not talk too much because it would tire her out and bother the other people there. The moment we walked through the front doors of that old red brick building, a group of women my mother's age surrounded us like they had been waiting. Mildred, my mother's closest friend from church, the woman who had sat next to her in the same pew every Sunday for 20 years, grabbed my mother's hands and held on tight. "Alberta, we called you dozens of times and the line kept going dead. We thought you were in the hospital or that you had moved away without telling anyone." My mother stood there looking around the room, her long sleeves suddenly feeling even heavier in a space full of women in short-sleeve blouses and summer dresses. I stepped back and listened, and what I heard confirmed something I had been afraid to put together. Marcus had not just taken control of the money, he had cut off every connection my mother had to the outside world. He took her phone. He told her friends she was too confused to talk. He turned my mother into someone who believed she really was becoming forgetful and useless, because when the only voice you hear every day is the one telling you that you are a burden, you start to believe it. What he had done to her spirit was just as damaging as what he had done to her body. My mother's eyes filled with tears when Mildred told her about the book club meetings she had missed, the Wednesday potlucks, the Christmas card exchange that had gone on without her for the first time in 18 years. "Marcus said I needed complete rest," my mother whispered, her voice so quiet it barely carried across the table. And even then she glanced toward the door like she expected him to walk through it at any second even though he was 5 miles away. I watched the women around that table reach out to my mother with the kind of simple, honest care that Marcus had never given her, and I made a promise to myself that the silence was ending here. I was going to get her phone back, get her Sundays back, and most of all, get her a place back in the community that had loved her long before Marcus decided she did not deserve one. On the drive home, my mother sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap, and she did not say anything for a long time. Then she turned to me and said, "Elena, I forgot what it felt like to have someone happy to see me." She said it so simply, without any drama, and that was the part that made it hard for me to keep my eyes on the road. After the visit to the senior center, I understood that my mother needed more than comfort. She needed to feel like she still mattered, like she still had a place in the world that was hers. Marcus had been shrinking her life down to the size of a dark corner in her own dining room, so I decided I was going to do the opposite. I was going to open it back up, starting right there on the front porch of our Georgia house. I spent all of Saturday afternoon with my mother cleaning up the front porch, sweeping away the cobwebs that had taken over the rocking chairs nobody had sat in for months, wiping down the old wooden table that my father had built by hand one summer when I was 12. We brewed a big pitcher of sweet tea, the real kind with too much sugar the way she had always made it, and pulled out the grill to fix some chicken and corn the way people in our neighborhood had done on Saturday evenings for as long as anyone could remember. For the first time in months, I watched my mother take off that heavy cardigan. She was still shy about the fading bruises on her upper arms, covering them with a lighter silk blouse instead. But the fact that she was willing to let some air touch her skin told me something had begun to shift. I watched her arranging flowers in the old porcelain vase that had belonged to my grandmother, the one she had not taken out of the cabinet since Marcus moved in. Her eyes brightened when I asked her to show me how she seasoned chicken the way women in the South have been doing for generations. The wet rub with paprika and cayenne and a little bit of brown sugar that her own mother had taught her. In that moment, she was not a victim. She was not a patient. She was Alberta Morrison, a woman who knew things worth knowing, passing them down to her daughter the way it was supposed to be done. I kept thinking that restoring my mother's dignity was not going to start with legal paperwork. It was going to start with letting her do the things that made her feel like herself. Mildred showed up right on time, and she brought along 3 other women from First Baptist who carried foil-covered dishes and Tupperware full of cobbler and potato salad. Marcus appeared in the doorway and stood there with a look on his face that made it clear he did not want these people in his house, but there was nothing he could do about it with half the neighborhood standing on the porch. I invited him to sit down and join us, but he made a sound in his throat and turned back inside, letting the screen door slam behind him. His absence was the best thing that could have happened, because the moment he was gone, my mother started talking. Really talking. The stories came out of her like water that had been held behind a dam. Stories about my father, about the old neighborhood, about the time she and Mildred drove all the way to Savannah for a church retreat and got a flat tire on the highway and had to flag down a trucker. I sat next to my mother and listened to her laugh, really laugh, the sound mixing with the cicadas and the breeze moving through the pine trees at the edge of the yard. This was the picture I had carried with me on every deployment, the simple thing I had been trying to get back to. The feeling of people sitting together sharing food and sharing time because they chose to, not because they had to. Every neighbor who came to that porch was doing something Marcus had never done. They were seeing my mother. They were treating her like she was still here, still real, still someone worth visiting on a Saturday evening. I watched her hold Mildred's hand, and this time she did not flinch. "Elena, thank you," my mother whispered into my ear as we walked the last guest to her car. The words were so quiet I almost missed them, but they landed on me like something solid, something that had weight. I understood then that what my mother had needed all this time was not money and not promises. She needed to be seen again, to be Alberta Morrison and not the burden that Marcus had made her believe she was. We stood together under the porch light, the light that Marcus had kept turned off for months, and the glow of it fell across my mother's face like something being returned to its rightful owner. That night, I lay in my childhood bedroom listening to my mother move softly through the kitchen, the familiar sound of her making tea the way she always did before bed, the clink of the spoon against the cup, the quiet hum of a woman who felt safe enough to move through her own house without permission. The calm I felt was real, but I knew it was temporary. Marcus was not going to let this stand. I had challenged him in front of people, brought witnesses into a space he had been controlling for over a year, and a man like that does not let go of what he believes is his. I started organizing the last of the legal documents I would need to take the next step. The fight for my mother's dignity was about to become something Marcus could not ignore. The porch still smelled like charcoal and sweet tea when I finally turned off the light and closed my eyes. But sleep did not come easy. I kept thinking about the look on Marcus's face when he stood in that doorway watching my mother smile, and the way his jaw tightened like he was doing the math on how much control he had just lost. I knew that look. I had seen it on men who were about to do something reckless because their pride had been wounded. And in my experience, those were the most dangerous hours. The ones right after someone realizes the ground beneath them is starting to crack. The peace on the porch lasted until late that same evening. The last guest had barely pulled out of the driveway, and I was still stacking plates in the kitchen when the air inside the house changed. I could feel it before I heard it, a heaviness that pressed down on everything like the minutes before a summer storm, and then I heard footsteps, hard and deliberate, moving down the hallway toward my mother's bedroom. I was jolted from a half-sleep by shouting that came from the hallway like a fist through drywall. Marcus had my mother backed into the corner of her room, his hand clamped on her shoulder, shaking her hard enough that the porcelain vase on the nightstand rattled against the lamp. "You senile old woman, what are you holding on to that 401k password for when I am drowning in debt trying to keep this house running?" His voice filled the room with contempt, every word aimed at making her feel small. From the doorway, I could see my mother curling inward, her hands pressed flat against her chest the way a child does when they are trying to protect themselves from someone bigger. All I could think was, this is it. This is the sacrifice he has been talking about. This is what staying looks like when staying means using your mother's fear to get what you want. I understood in that moment that Marcus had been using the words, "I am the one who stayed," the way a locksmith uses a key, opening doors that should have been closed to him, and behind every one of those doors was my mother, alone and afraid. When Marcus saw me standing there, he dropped his hand from her shoulder like it was on fire, and the smile came back, automatic, the way a screensaver pops up when nobody is touching the computer. "Oh, Elena, you know how Mom gets. She keeps forgetting her passwords. So I was just trying to help her remember." He said it so smoothly, so casually, that if I had not seen what I had just seen, I might have believed him. My mother looked at me and her eyes were begging, but not for me to go after Marcus. She was begging me to let it go, to keep the peace, to hold the family together by pretending that what had just happened was normal. The fact that she wanted to protect him even now, after everything, broke something in me that I did not know could still break. I stood between the two of them in that hallway, and I saw the whole thing clearly for the first time. Marcus had spent years convincing my mother that she was a burden, that without him she would be lost, that his presence in this house was a gift she should be grateful for. He had made her believe that the price of his company was her silence and her savings and her body when he lost his temper. I had been thousands of miles away doing my job while my mother paid for my absence with her safety and her dignity. I kept thinking about the cost of all those months I spent trusting his phone calls, trusting his emails, trusting his version of the truth because it was easier than asking the hard questions. "Marcus, take your hands off our mother. Right now." I said it in the voice I use when I give an order, not loud, not angry, just the flat, calm tone that does not leave room for negotiation. He froze for a second, and I watched the confusion cross his face, because nobody had spoken to him like that in this house for a very long time. He snorted, turned on his heel, and walked out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the pictures on the wall. I went to my mother and gently pushed her sleeve up to look at the new bruises layered over the old ones, fresh purple marks on top of the fading yellow ones that told me this had been happening for a long time. That night, in that Georgia house, the line had been drawn. I think most of us have watched someone we love change in a way we could not explain, becoming quieter, smaller, more careful around a certain person in the family, and we did not have the right word for what we were seeing. Maybe you have been in a room where someone you care about flinched at a voice that should have felt safe, or maybe you have been the one doing the flinching. If you have ever had to stand between your mother and someone who was supposed to love her, or if you have watched something happen behind a closed door that you knew was not right, share your story with me in the comments. And if you want to stay with me until the moment the truth comes out into the light, hit subscribe, because no mother should have to live in silence. Monday morning, when the first light came through the pine trees and fell across the living room floor, I set a thick folder on the coffee table right next to Marcus's steaming cup of Maxwell House. It was time for the numbers to speak, since his words had been nothing but lies. "We need to talk about the $500 a month you have been reporting for Mom's prescriptions," I began, and I kept my voice level and precise the way I would in a budget review. I pushed the highlighted bank statement across the table toward Marcus. Jennifer was standing behind him, and the smirk she had been wearing since I arrived disappeared the moment she saw the photographs I had taken of my mother's empty medicine cabinet. Marcus started to say something, but I did not let him finish. I laid the $5,000 tuition check on the table next to the statement, the one with the forged signature, and I watched his face change. I looked at my mother sitting beside me. Her hand was gripping the edge of her silk blouse, and her eyes were wide and fixed on the evidence spread across the table, proof that her own son had been stealing from her while she went without medication. This was the hardest part of any audit I had ever conducted. Not finding the missing money, but showing a mother that the child she had raised and loved and defended had done this to her. Marcus started shaking, his face going red, and he tried the line he had been using for years, the one about how he had sacrificed everything to stay and take care of her. But the numbers on that table did not lie, and his version of sacrifice did not add up anymore. And this is the most important part, I said, laying the power of attorney application he had filed in secret on the table between us. You declared that our mother has complete memory loss so you could freeze her Medicare. You wanted to put her in assisted living so you could sell this house. Marcus slammed his fist on the table so hard the coffee cup jumped, and Jennifer flinched backward. What do you know about anything? You disappeared for 15 years, and I am the one who had to empty bedpans and listen to this old woman ramble every single night. He was screaming, and the mask was gone, completely gone, and the person underneath it was exactly who I had come home to find. My mother seemed to shrink under the sound of his voice, her body folding into itself the way it had been doing for months, maybe years. I kept thinking about the sheer absurdity of a man who had been draining his mother's account standing there claiming he was the real victim. What I felt was not anger anymore. It was something deeper and quieter than anger, a kind of sickness that came from looking at someone I had shared a childhood with and not recognizing a single thing about him. He had taken more than money. He had taken the feeling of safety out of my mother's own home. I reached over and held her hand, and I could feel her pulse racing through her thin skin. Be quiet, Marcus. I have already contacted a lawyer and the local police about elder financial fraud, I said, and I did not raise my voice. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in that room. Jennifer backed against the wall, her face drained of color. Marcus stared at me with bloodshot eyes, and I could see him calculating whether to lunge at me or run, and the steadiness in my posture told him neither one was going to work. For the first time in a very long time, the balance in this house had started to shift. I looked at my mother. She was not crying. She was sitting very still, staring at the forged power of attorney form on the table, and I knew what was happening behind her eyes. She was letting go of the son she thought she still had. That kind of loss does not come with tears. It comes with silence. The kind of silence that means a door has been closed, and it is not going to open again the same way. I was not going to let Marcus take one more thing from this woman. Not another check, not another dollar, and not another word that made her feel like she did not belong in her own home. I held my mother's hand through all of it, and when Marcus finally stopped yelling and stood there panting like a man who had run out of ammunition, the room went quiet in a way that I knew meant something permanent had changed. Jennifer quietly picked up her purse and walked into the bedroom without saying a word. Marcus looked at my mother one last time, and what I saw on his face was not remorse. It was the look of a man counting his losses. He turned and walked out of the room, and the sound of the front door closing behind him was the most honest sound that house had heard in years. I sat with my mother for a long time after that. Neither of us spoke. The coffee on the table went cold. The folder full of evidence sat between us like a third person in the room, holding all the truths that had been buried under years of silence and fear. My mother reached over and closed the folder slowly, with both hands, and then she placed her palm flat on top of it like she was pressing something down, sealing it shut. I did not know if she was closing a chapter or opening one, but I knew that the woman sitting across from me was not the same woman who had been hunched in a folding chair 2 days ago. Something in her had straightened. After everything that had happened with Marcus that morning, I needed a place where I could breathe without the walls closing in. I drove to the cemetery on the edge of town, the one shaded by the old Georgia pines that had been standing there longer than anyone alive could remember. My father was buried under those trees, in a quiet spot near the back, where the groundskeeper kept the grass trimmed short, and the headstones stood in neat rows like they were waiting for someone to visit. I sat down on the ground next to his headstone, the gray granite already warm from the afternoon sun, and I ran my fingers over the letters of his name that had started to soften with time. My father was a carpenter, a man who said very little but showed you who he was by what he did with his hands. He taught me about doing the right thing not through lectures, but through the way he spent his Saturdays fixing porch steps and building shelves for the widows on our street without ever sending an invoice. I kept thinking about something he used to say to me on Sunday evenings, sitting in his recliner after church, quoting Mr. Rogers the way some men quote scripture. Look for the helpers, and when you grow up, be one of them. He said it so many times that I stopped hearing it after a while, the way you stop hearing a clock tick when you have lived with it long enough. But sitting there at his grave, with everything that was happening back at the house, those words came back to me like he was saying them for the first time. That was the thing I needed to hear right then, in the middle of feeling wrung out by what my brother had become. My father had trusted me to take care of my mother. Not just the house, not just the accounts, but the woman herself, her spirit, her right to live her last years with someone who treated her like she mattered. I kept thinking about how my own silence over the past year and a half had been its own kind of failure. How every time I accepted Marcus's updates without questioning them, I was letting my father down. Marcus could talk about sacrifice all he wanted, but the real kindness, the kind my father had lived every day of his life, was the thing my mother deserved to feel in the years she had left. I stood up from the grave and felt something settle in me. Not peace exactly, but a steadiness that had not been there before. I was my father's daughter, and I was going to finish what I had started. I was going to make sure every dollar, every document, and every lie was accounted for, and I was going to give my mother back what had been taken. Driving away from the cemetery, I looked up at the wide Georgia sky, and I knew that even though my father was not here to see it, the man who had taught me to look for the helpers would have understood exactly what I was about to do. I knew I could not do this alone. I needed someone who could speak the language of the law and make what had happened inside our family walls mean something in a courtroom. The next morning, I called Tom Sullivan, the attorney who had handled my father's will 10 years ago, the man my father had trusted enough to put our family's future in his hands. I asked him to come to the house to meet with my mother, and he said he would be there by 9. Sullivan walked in with the quiet authority of a man who had been doing this work for 40 years, carrying a leather briefcase that was cracked at the corners and worn soft with use. He greeted my mother the way a person greets someone they respect, calling her Mrs. Morrison, taking her hand gently, looking her in the eye the way Marcus had stopped doing a long time ago. We sat at the kitchen table with tea and the documents I had gathered, and Sullivan opened the original power of attorney that my father had drawn up, the one Marcus assumed had been destroyed. The papers were still in their original folder, filed properly, every page intact. For the first time in what felt like years, I watched my mother sit up straight. She was listening to a professional explain her rights without Marcus standing behind her making sure she stayed quiet. Sullivan's presence in that kitchen was like an anchor dropping into rough water, something solid that held the room steady. I kept thinking that what my mother needed was not just protection. She needed a witness. She needed someone outside the family to look at what had been done to her and say out loud that it was wrong. Mrs. Morrison, these records show that your financial authority was never legally transferred. Any changes made without your informed consent are invalid under Georgia law, Sullivan said, his voice the kind of calm that comes from decades of experience. He walked her through the original documents, showed her the signatures, her name and my father's name in ink that had faded at the edges but still held. My mother took the papers in her hands and held them carefully, and I watched her thin fingers trace her own name on the page like she was relearning that it still belonged to her. Marcus was out on the porch, watching through the window with an expression that made it clear he understood exactly what was happening. His face had gone dark the way it always did when he was losing control, and for the first time I saw something besides anger in his eyes. I saw the beginning of fear, watching my mother's posture change, watching hope come back into her face after 18 months of living under my brother's control, told me we were on the right path. What we were doing in that kitchen was not just a legal process, it was giving a woman back the voice that had been taken from her. We will begin the process of revoking all unauthorized power of attorney immediately, Sullivan said as he shook my hand at the door. I thanked him with a relief so deep it almost made my knees buckle. Something real had been set in motion, and this time Marcus was not going to be able to talk his way out of it. My mother looked at me and smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I had seen on her face since I had come home, the kind that reached her eyes and stayed there. Sometimes the person who helps you the most is not someone in your family. Sometimes it is a stranger with the right kind of knowledge who walks through your door and tells you what you already know, but have been too afraid to say. If you have ever found someone like that, a friend, a lawyer, a neighbor, anyone who stood beside you when your own family would not, tell me about them in the comments, and hit that like button, because kindness like that deserves to be recognized. After Sullivan left, my mother sat at the kitchen table for a while longer, just holding the folder of documents in her lap like something precious she had found after years of thinking it was lost. She poured herself a fresh cup of tea and stirred it slowly, and I could see the gears turning behind her eyes, the recalculation that happens when a person starts to believe they might actually have a say in what happens next. I sat across from her and let the silence be what it was, not the heavy silence of fear, but the quiet kind that comes when two people are on the same side and both of them know it. After the meeting with Sullivan, there was nothing left to hide behind. Marcus had gone too far, and my mother's silence had run out. I sat with her on the porch that evening and put the official notice in her hands, the document that would require Marcus to leave the house he had been treating as his own. It was something she needed to sign herself, because this had to come from her if it was going to mean anything. My mother picked up the pen, and her hand was steady, steadier than I had seen it in months. She looked at me, then looked out past the porch railing to the pine trees, and she took a breath that seemed to draw in courage from somewhere deeper than I could see. She signed her name, Alberta Morrison, in handwriting that was bold and clear, and nothing like the shaking scrawl Marcus had been putting on checks in her name. I owed him care, she said, her voice low and firm. But I did not owe him this. It was the strongest sentence I had ever heard her speak. When Marcus came through the door with the same aggressive energy he carried everywhere, I handed him the paper. You have 24 hours to pack your things and Jennifer's things and leave this house, I said, and I did not look away from him. He started to shout, started to raise his hand the way he always did when he wanted to make someone afraid, but then he saw the two officers from the county sheriff's office standing on the other side of the screen door, and his mouth closed. The authority he had built in this house, the kind that runs on fear and not on law, collapsed the moment it met a boundary that could not be shaken or shouted down. I watched Marcus and Jennifer load their car with shopping bags full of clothes and electronics bought with my mother's money. There was a feeling in my chest that I did not expect. Not satisfaction, but a deep, clean relief, like stepping out of a building you did not realize had no air in it. Marcus tried one last thing as he was leaving, telling my mother she would never see her grandchildren again, but my mother looked at him, and there was no fear in her face anymore. Just a sadness that was older and deeper than anything Marcus could threaten her with. The house felt different the moment they were gone, like someone had opened every window at once. We started clearing out the cheap plastic dishes and the clutter that Marcus had spread through the dining room like he owned the place. My mother went to the china cabinet, opened the glass doors, and took out the porcelain set that my father had bought her for their 25th anniversary. She washed each plate by hand, slowly, with dish soap that smelled like pine, and the sound of running water and clinking china was the most beautiful sound I had heard in that house in years. I put my arms around her from behind and held her while she dried the last plate. "You did the right thing, Mom." She smiled, the kind of smile that comes from someone who has just walked out of a dark room into daylight. We stood on the porch together and looked out at the yard, and the porch light was on, bright and warm, the way my father used to leave it when he was waiting for us to come home. That night, with Marcus gone and the house quiet in a way it had not been quiet for a long time, my mother and I sat at the dining table together. She was in my father's chair, the chair at the head of the table, and I was sitting to her right in the spot where I had always sat as a child. She poured 2 cups of decaf from the pot she had brewed herself, and we sat there without talking for a while, just being in the same room without fear, without listening for footsteps, without waiting for a door to slam. I kept thinking about what it must have cost her to sign that paper, to put her name on a document that would send her own son away from the house where she had raised him. I knew she was not celebrating. She was grieving in her way for the son she had hoped Marcus would be, the one who stayed because he loved her and not because he wanted what she had. But there was no regret in her posture. She sat straight in that chair with both hands around her cup, and she looked like the woman I grew up watching, the one who made decisions and stuck with them, and did not need anyone's permission to know she was right. When Marcus was gone and the house belonged to just the 2 of us again, my mother told me to sit down in my father's chair at the head of the table. She went to the bedroom closet, reached behind the winter coats, and pulled out a metal box that I had never seen before, the kind with a latch that takes a small key, the kind people use for things they intend to keep hidden for a very long time. She set it on the table between us like it was something sacred. She opened the box, and inside were property certificates for a commercial building in New York City, a building that had been in her family from her first marriage, a building worth $28 million that my father had never touched because he believed it was hers and hers alone. I went completely still. Marcus had been stealing a few $100,000 from her savings account, picking her pocket month by month, and the whole time he had no idea that the real fortune was sitting in a metal box behind my mother's winter coat. "I let him take the savings because I felt like I owed him, Elena," my mother said, and her voice cracked on my name. She took my hand and held it tight, and her eyes were wet but steady, the way they get when she has made up her mind to say something she has been carrying for a long time. She told me the truth that had been locked inside that box along with the papers. 30 years ago, when I was 6 years old, I needed emergency heart surgery, the kind that costs more than a family like ours could afford. My father made a decision without telling anyone. He used Marcus's college fund, all of it, every dollar that had been set aside for Marcus to go to law school, and he used it to pay the hospital bills that saved my life. Marcus lost his future because of me, and my mother had spent the last 3 decades trying to make it up to him by enduring whatever he did to her, the grabbing, the shouting, the stealing, all of it, because she believed she owed him a debt that could never be fully paid. "You do not owe anyone your suffering, Mom," I said, and I could not keep my voice from breaking. All the pieces of my mother's silence fell into place with a cruelty I had not prepared for. She had not been weak. She had been carrying a guilt so enormous that she was willing to let her own son destroy her if it meant balancing a debt that was never hers to pay. I kept thinking that her dignity was not in the building in New York or the money in the bank. It was in the 30 years she had spent quietly protecting me without ever once telling me what it cost her. I stood up, dried my face, and took both of her hands in mine. I will manage the trust. Marcus will receive a fair share for what he lost back then, but he will never be allowed to hurt you again. She nodded slowly, the way she does when she agrees with something she has been waiting to hear. We drove the paperwork to Sullivan's office that same afternoon, and when the documents were filed and the trust was established, the weight of 30 years of silence lifted off my mother's shoulders in a way I could physically see. She sat taller in the passenger seat on the ride home. When Marcus found out about the building, when Sullivan called him into the office and laid out the full picture of what his mother had been holding in reserve all this time, he went still. Not angry, not loud, just still. And I did not feel any kind of satisfaction watching him realize that his own greed had cost him the very thing my mother had been planning to give him freely. All I felt was the relief of knowing my mother was finally free. What had been done to her had been named, documented, and stopped, and what had been taken was being returned. Alberta Morrison's name was going back where it belonged. We walked out of Sullivan's office into the Georgia sunset. My mother took a deep breath, the kind that fills your whole chest, and she lifted her chin and walked beside me with her arms uncovered. No long sleeves, no silk scarf, nothing to hide. The building in New York was just a number on a piece of paper. The real thing we had gotten back that day was something no amount of money could buy. My mother was wearing short sleeves in the Georgia heat for the first time in over a year, and she was not covering anything up. The truth had done what the truth does when you finally let it out. That evening, my mother cooked dinner for the first time in months. Not something heated up from a box, but a real meal, the kind she used to make, with biscuits from scratch, and green beans from the garden and chicken fried in the cast-iron skillet that had been in our family for 3 generations. She set the table with the good china, 2 place settings, and she put fresh flowers in the vase. I sat at the table and watched her move through her own kitchen with a freedom that made my throat tight, because every movement she made, every cabinet she opened, every burner she turned on, was a declaration that this house was hers and she was home. After dinner, we sat on the porch and watched the fireflies. My mother reached over and held my hand, and neither of us said anything for a long time. There was nothing left that needed to be said. The papers were filed, the accounts were secured, the locks had been changed, and somewhere across town, Marcus was sitting with the knowledge that the fortune he had been too greedy to wait for was now protected by the very legal system he had tried to manipulate. The months passed, and the bruises on my mother's arms faded until there was nothing left but smooth skin that caught the light on the front porch every afternoon. Fall came to Georgia the way it always does, gentle and cool, and our house smelled like cornbread again, the real kind, baked from scratch the way my mother had been making it since before I was born. This Thanksgiving, the long table was covered with her best embroidered cloth, the one she had been saving in tissue paper at the back of the linen closet. My mother sat in the chair at the head of the table, the same chair my father had always kept for her, and the light from the old chandelier fell across her face, the way sunlight falls on something that has been brought back from a long time in the dark. Around her were the people who had shown up when it mattered, Mildred and the women from First Baptist, neighbors who had carried food to the porch and stayed to listen, people who had chosen to see her when the person closest to her had tried to make her disappear. I sat beside my mother and held the hand she now rested openly on the tablecloth, a hand with no sleeves pulled over it, no scarf wrapped around the wrist, nothing hidden. Her name was back on the mailbox out front, painted in clean letters that could be read from the street. We learned something that year, my mother and I. A house is not built out of lumber and brick. It is built out of truth, and out of the courage it takes to say the hardest things out loud before the silence becomes the only thing anyone can hear.